The Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today, the civilized world faces an unprecedented level of violence fueled by Islamic extremism. Recent reports indicate that over 30,000 people from over 100 different countries have traveled to the conflict zone in Syria and Iraq to wage jihad since 2011. This group includes over 4,500 Westerners and over 250 Americans who have attempted or actually joined Islamic supremacist groups. Both al-Qaeda's global network and ISIS, among several other terrorist networks around the world, promote an ideology grounded in Islamic extremism and conquest. As the Congressional Research Service has found, these terrorists use Islam as an ideological and/or religious justification for the belief in the establishment of a global caliphate, a jurisdiction governed by a Muslim civil and religious leader known as a caliph via violent means. As the ideology of militant Islam spreads, the threat to the U.S. and our allies, such as Israel, persists. Terrorist networks like al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS, as well as extremist clerics and others, seek to spread this ideology in order to recruit, engage sympathizers, and criticize the West. Indeed, this propaganda is playing a role in promoting terrorist attacks in the U.S., where many homegrown cases of jihadi terrorism involve the use of social media. Several sources indicate that there are 90,000 pro-ISIS tweets on a daily basis, while others suggest that there may be as many as 200,000 such tweets. Accounts belonging to other foreign terrorist organizations, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, have a total of over 200,000 followers and are thriving. Official Twitter accounts belonging to Jabhat al-Nusra operate much like those belonging to ISIS, tweeting similar extremist content. ISIS's use of platforms like Twitter is highly effective. YouTube videos depicting violent acts against Westerners are used to incite others to take up arms and wage jihad. While foreign fighters travel overseas for training and to make other terrorist connections, it's becoming apparent that Islamic recruits in the United States and other parts of the world who are unable to travel to these battlegrounds do not necessarily need to do so in order to receive training and inspiration. They can engage real-time with jihadists on Twitter, watch ISIS's murderous propaganda on YouTube, view jihadi selfies on Instagram, or read religious justifications for the killing of civilians on Just Paste It. The question and answer website, ask.fm, has also become a popular platform for jihadists. Unfortunately, ISIS's use of social media is believed to be resonating with vulnerable populations, particularly Muslim converts and susceptible alienated youth. However, radicalization of Americans cannot be narrowed to any single social or demographic profile. Instead, the Americans who are being radicalized to support and fight for Islamic extremists come from all walks of life. Those Americans who travel overseas to support terrorist groups can also incite others back by their actions to conduct attacks and can themselves return back to the U.S. with training to complete terrorist attacks. The bottom line is that these foreign fighters have been trained in combat, have strong ties to terrorist groups, and can recruit others to join the fight. The U.S. government has the ability under the law to revoke passports on several grounds, including reasons of national security. The administration they plan to utilize immigration controls as other countries have in order to stop foreign fighters. Nor is the danger posed to the United States by foreign fighters limited to those terrorists and adherents to terrorist groups who are U.S. citizens. In order to enter the United States, citizens of most countries must obtain visas issued at overseas embassies and consulates by the State Department. In 2014, the State Department issued almost 10 million visas to foreigners seeking temporary entry into America and nearly 500,000 immigrant visas for permanent residents. This process plays a crucial role in detecting individuals with terrorist ties and stopping them from entering the United States. Despite these safeguards, many of the subjects who have been convicted on terrorism charges in the United States since 9/11 are aliens who traveled to America on visas, including student visas, tourist visas, and green cards. This danger is compounded by the large number of foreign fighters from visa waiver countries who do not even need a visa to enter our country. Federal and state governments, as well as communities, have begun to take action to mitigate the threat of terrorist propaganda on social media. However, they have experienced multiple challenges in combating this threat. The unprecedented speed with which people are being radicalized by violent Islamist supremacists is difficult to keep up with and is straining the ability of government to monitor and intercept suspects. Jihadists using increasingly secure websites and applications and communicating in code with Americans and Westerners in the United States present even further challenges for law enforcement in tracking, identifying, and apprehending those who seek to engage in terrorist attacks. In order to combat this threat, this trend, we must ensure that law enforcement has the necessary tools to do its job. Efforts to counter and deter unconventional information warfare must be joined with other government agencies' efforts to deal with the problem of terror on social media. I thank our witnesses for their testimony today and look forward to examining issues related to the use of social media by terrorists, the extent that people are being radicalized, and what could be done to combat this growing problem. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the use of social media by the Islamic State, and would like to thank today's witnesses for helping the committee with its work. As noted by Jessica Stern and J.M. Berger in their recent book, ISIS, The State of Terror, the Islamic State, also known as ISIL, has been prolific in its ability to exploit a variety of social media platforms. According to the authors, jihadists have been making slick propaganda for decades, but for a long time these productions catered to an exclusive audience of potential recruits, never making the evening news or creeping into the collective consciousness of the West. However, in stark contrast, ISIL and its online supporters continue to use Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social networking services to broadcast their terrorist messages to a global audience in real time and significantly extend their recruitment, mobilization, and financing efforts beyond the battlefields in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Last week, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, again a J.M. Berger report, issued the existence, noticed the existence of over 40,000 accounts actively supporting the Islamic State on Twitter, with an estimated 2,000 accounts tweeting in English. The majority of these users form the core of the ISIL's aggressive online recruitment strategy. This strategy is designed to introduce recruitment targets to the Islamic State ideology, to groom and lavish attention on potential recruits through subsequent communication in private online channels, and directly call them to jihad, ranging from lone wolf-style attacks at home to migration to the Islamic State. The Islamic State even has a name for its most enthusiastic online users, Mujtahidun, or the industrious ones. Jessica Stern and J.M. Berger note that these online supporters are far more active than their counterparts in Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria or al-Shabaab in Somalia in using social media tactics to expand their reach. The impact of ISIL's extensive social media presence has already been witnessed in the unprecedented flood of foreign fighters to Iraq and Syria. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to travel with several House and Senate members and a congressional delegation to the Syrian-Turkish border area north of Aleppo. We were briefed on the lack of meaningful progress in our train and equip program of so-called moderate rebels. We also met with representatives of about a half-dozen rebel groups, and the only common characteristic between these groups was, one, they all saw Bashar al-Assad and his regime as the primary enemy, and secondly, they all used WhatsApp as their platform for communication. As reported in September of 2015 by the Bipartisan Congressional Task Force on Combating Terrorism and Foreign Travel, nearly 30,000 foreign fighters have traveled to Iraq and Syria since 2011 to join the Islamic State, including an estimated 250 individuals from the United States who have sought to fight on the side of the extremists in ISIL conflict zones. There's also more direct evidence of the effect of Islamic State's online strategy here at home. According to the West Point report, excuse me, at least 60 individuals have been arrested in the United States in 2015 for criminal acts in support of the Islamic State. Social media has played a role in the recruitment or radicalization in almost every single case. As ranking member for the Financial Services Committee's task force to investigate terrorism financing, I'm well aware that ISIL and other terrorist groups are also using social media platform funding for terrorist activity. Last year, David Cohen, who was then the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at Treasury, remarked that constraining the flow of funds to terrorist groups is, and this is a quote, particularly challenging in an area when social media allows anyone with an Internet connection to set himself up as an international terrorist financier, close quote. In particular, we've seen that private funding networks are relying on social media to solicit so-called charitable donations and inconspicuously connect donors with recipients on the battlefield. In response to the exploitation of social media by ISIL and other terrorist groups, Twitter and other service providers have slowly, and I must say grudgingly in some cases, begun to take some action to suspend terrorism-linked users' accounts. This is often called whack-a-mole approach to countering terrorism messaging, as suspended users can simply create new accounts. Jessica Stern and other analysts have noted that, to a certain extent, this strategy can prove effective in disrupting, for a while, and eventually downgrading terrorist social networks. In addition, in 2011, the U.S. has established the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications at the State Department, which for the past couple of years has focused on countering ISIL propaganda. However, as noted by one of today's witnesses, Ambassador Fernandez, the Center's budget over 3 years totaled the cost of a single Reaper drone, $15 million, and has remained the same since 2012. The team of operators and editors working in Arabic and English has not exceeded 15 people at any one time. The Center has also been operating amidst congressional budget constraints and hiring freezes that result as federal agencies when Congress continues to enact short-term funding resolutions instead of traditional appropriations bills. We may have some progress in that regard. That's pending. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that we must do more to counter the social media threat posed by the Islamic State and other terrorist groups. I look forward to discussing what additional steps we can take to strengthen our counterterrorism strategy in this regard, as well as support corresponding international, private sector, law enforcement, and community efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of our time.
Thank you. I'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Mark Wallace, Chief Executive Officer of the Counter-Extremism Project, Mr. Walter Purdy, President of the Terrorism Research Center, Mr. David Gartenstein-Ross, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you could please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. Ambassador Wallace, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. And it is obviously my great pleasure and honor to appear with my distinguished colleagues on this panel. The hijacking and weaponization of social media platforms by extremist groups to radicalize, recruit, and plan violent attacks against innocent people around the world is a cancer that continues to grow largely unabated. Today, there are at least 43,000 active pro-ISIS Twitter accounts, endlessly amplifying and repeating ISIS's messages of hate and terror. The more than 30,000 people who have joined ISIS from around the world is a testament to the power of social media. On September 11th of this year, CEP, the Counter-Extremism Project, released profiles of 66 Americans who have joined or allegedly attempted to join the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, as well as other Americans accused of planning attacks on U.S. soil, providing financial assistance to extremist entities, or propagandizing on their behalf. These individuals have very different backgrounds and experiences, but the one characteristic that they seem to share is active participation on social media. In addition, we will soon release profiles on 54 of the most prolific social media propagandists. Through hashtag CEP Digital Disruption, we have identified and reported hundreds of extremists to Twitter. And in June, we expanded our campaign to include monitoring of Twitter accounts in French, Italian, German, and Turkish. We respect and honor our American constitutional traditions of free speech. Our standard for reporting an account as incitement of violence or direct threats. To be clear, we are concerned about various social media platforms. Our focus is on Twitter because it is effectively the gateway drug where individuals, usually young people, are first exposed to propaganda and radical content. It is, of course, an enormously successful platform, Twitter, and ubiquitous. In many ways, that success has spurred its misuse by online jihadis. We wrote 3 letters to Twitter, but the response we've gotten is dismissive to the point of dereliction. Twitter's attitude can be best summarized in a quote provided to Mother Jones magazine by a Twitter official. They said, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." I want to repeat that. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Of course, this statement is insipid and unserious, particularly in the context of al-Qaeda, ISIS, and many other extremist groups. Sally Jones epitomizes Twitter's failure to act effectively. Jones, known on Twitter as Hassan al-Britani, is a British ISIS operative. In September, Jones issued a kill list of 100 U.S. servicemen. She was named an SDN, global terrorist, and placed on the United Nations Security Council sanctions list. And yet in October, Jones urged violence on Twitter against Navy SEAL veteran Robert O'Neill and Dillard Johnson, a former Army sergeant. If Twitter can beef up its policies as it relates to bullying and harassment of women, why does it show such dismissiveness when it comes to those promoting and glorifying terror? We stand ready to work with Congress, the administration, and any company, including Twitter, in finding the right mix of remedies that effectively attacks this growing problem while protecting our values and liberties. We believe there are clear and immediate changes that all social media companies could make. First, one of the problems we've encountered is that many social media companies place accounts that have been reported into a rolling queue. We believe that by giving CEP, as well as others like the State Department, trusted reporting status and opening a direct line of communication, we can more easily and swiftly identify and remove the most notorious extremists online. Second, our campaign relies in part on our stakeholder audience, also reporting accounts. But the reporting process on Twitter and other social media sites is long and cumbersome. Twitter recently started a streamlined reporting process for women to report harassment or stalking, which is great, but reporting a violent extremist still falls into a catch-all category. Third, while every organization is different, we believe it is critical that America's most important tech companies show a united front when it comes to fighting violent extremism. This would include a clear public policy statement that extremist activities will not be tolerated. Fourth, shine the bright spotlight of transparency on the most egregious extremist accounts. This past year, one of the most influential social media jihadis, Shami Witness, was exposed and immediately shut down his accounts and stopped operating. We can collectively agree that the most egregious of cyber jihadis do not deserve anonymity or the right of free hate and incitement of terror speech through the use of Twitter or any other social media platform. Fifth, companies should be more proactively monitor content. It's one thing to take down, but they should more proactively monitor. While no social media company has been able to solve the problem completely, companies like Google and Facebook are at least willing to have a conversation and take steps to address the issue. I am convinced that there are strategies that we can bring to bear on those who attempt to hijack and weaponize social media platforms. The majority of social media companies are U.S. companies, but online misuse has global consequences. It is time that social media companies like Twitter take responsibility for the global implications of their platform and their lack of action. I would respectfully ask that my full remarks be included in the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member Lynch.
Thank you, Ambassador Wallace. Mr. Purdy, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me today to testify on this important issue. As I was driving down here this morning, I thought back to almost 14 years ago when I sat with an American young man from California who actually was radicalized in California, traveled overseas to Pakistan, made his way into Afghanistan, where he trained in a terrorist training camp. Today, individuals here in the United States don't have to undertake that journey that this individual from California did 14 years ago. Today, anybody with a smartphone or a computer can become radicalized online. Radicalization today takes so many different forms. There is no single pathway for someone becoming radicalized. And yet we see groups like al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, all using social media and internet today to act as enablers, providing a medium for these individuals seeking that path of self-radicalization. We see many works like Milestones, The Call to Global Jihad by Abu Musab al-Suri, Constance on the Path of Jihad by Anwar al-Awlaki. These constant themes keep coming up in ISIS, al-Nusra, and other terrorist social media, seeking to help radicalize these individuals before they go overseas and travel. These works constantly come up, and individuals here in the United States that have gone to social media sites, like some that you have mentioned in your opening statements, have helped to manipulate and motivate these individuals to undertake activities that run the spectrum from raising money, providing material support, undertaking to fight jihad here in the United States, traveling overseas to enter countries, Turkey, Greece, and others on their way to fight in Iraq and Syria, to plotting operations here in the United States. Many of these individuals that we see have started that process of radicalization by going online using the internet. Individuals like Nadal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, exchanged dozens of emails with his spiritual mentor, Anwar al-Awlaki. American citizens, Awlaki and Adam Gadon, both radicalized and recruited other individuals, sending people to various sites to help develop their radicalization. Virtual mentors today have communicated with potential recruits, and others deliver their messages to these individuals in blogs, websites, chat rooms, and forums. The use of encrypted communication today is a barrier in which law enforcement has to deal with to try to get to the bottom of this very challenging problem. Adam Gadon, in a propaganda video years ago, stated, "I advise every brother who wants to work for this religion not to undertake any action before taking advantage of the wide range of resources available today on the internet." Whether a group like Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, or ISIS, they all constantly point those individuals seeking to wage jihad here in the United States or abroad to the internet. The United States faces various challenges from homegrown violent extremists who have been radicalized to launch attacks here in the United States. We have seen a growing list of Americans who have traveled to fight jihad and support terrorist groups like ISIS overseas. Former director of the FBI, speaking about Americans who had gone overseas to fight, stated, "It raises the question of whether these young men one day will come home. And if so, what types of things will they undertake here?" Today, any American use social media to gain any sort of information and an understanding of all kinds of things that are placed on the internet. But these individuals are using this particular platform so that they can gain access to jihadi fighters in theater and also to help recruit and radicalize potential American fighters. The number of American fighters that have taken selfies, created digital propaganda of themselves, fuels this particular effort that we see. Since the Syrian conflict escalated, we've seen over 300 Americans attempt to or travel to or fight in Syria. Individuals like Nicole Mansfield, convert to Islam from Flint, Michigan. Individuals from Virginia, Massachusetts, Florida, have all gone and fought overseas. An American from Florida in May 25, 2014, actually went and became that first suicide bomber in Syria. He grew up in a gated community. This particular social media platform is the fire that fuels the radicalization and the challenge that we face. I would say one additional thing that we need to understand.
I appreciate it. We'll do your written comments. Your time's up, and we'll be sure to give you an opportunity in the question and answer to expand on that. And now, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. What I would like to focus on is the broader view of how social media is having an impact on the strategic information environment. Social media is revolutionary in so many ways, and I thought both the opening statements and also my colleagues have done a very good job of articulating those ways. But ultimately, it's something which is tried and true in an armed conflict. That is, it's a tool of strategic communication. I think in addition to understanding the direct impact of what ISIS is doing, we also need to understand how an organization like this, which has achieved a technical mastery of this strategic communication tool and also is branded by its over-the-top violence, we need to understand the impact that has on the overall information environment. Chairman DeSantis, you spoke of the many extremist groups today that are operating in Syria and elsewhere, and the many extremist groups that use this social media platform. ISIS is much more adept at it than others in terms of directly mobilizing people to their cause, but other groups also have their communication strategies. ISIS, of course, was born out of the al-Qaeda organization and now challenges it for supremacy over the global jihadist movement. In so many ways, ISIS's rise has harmed al-Qaeda, including stealing away their fighters, stealing away their affiliates, but in other ways, it's actually benefited the al-Qaeda organization. In fact, today, al-Qaeda members are speaking openly of the ways in which ISIS's rise has helped them in terms of their communication. In the latest issue of Al-Risala, which is an al-Qaeda-affiliated magazine published out of Syria, Usama Hamza Australi, who is a longtime confederate of the al-Qaeda organization, referred to ISIS's rise as a blessing in disguise. The reason he gave is that previously when people talked about extremism, they talked about people, Australi said, who waged jihad as being the extremists. Australi said now they know that it's not people who wage jihad that are the extremists. It's not those who avoid it who are moderates. Rather, he said, ISIS is the extremists, and we, al-Qaeda, are the moderates. Bin Laden recognized before his death that grave damage had been done to the al-Qaeda brand through the excesses of ISIS's predecessor, al-Qaeda in Iraq. He wanted to rebrand al-Qaeda, and he wanted to do this so badly, so deeply, that he even thought about changing the organization's name. Well, two things have given al-Qaeda tremendous opportunities, one of which is the Sunni-Shia conflict, which is racking the region, which has shifted strategic priorities and made some Sunni Gulf states see al-Qaeda as a possible counterbalance against Iran. The second thing is the rise of ISIS, which al-Qaeda is able to use as a foil. And they've done this successfully, much more successfully than we're now acknowledging, and in ways that are going to cause lasting problems for us. Right now, al-Qaeda is receiving state support. This is out in the open. The Jaish al-Fatah coalition, of which both al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, and also the other jihadist group, Ahrar al-Sham, are leading members, receives open support from Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. In Yemen, al-Qaeda is at the forefront of opposing the advance of Iranian-backed Houthis. Right now, al-Qaeda controls territory on the ground in Yemen, in al-Muqalla, which is the 5th largest city, and also in Aden. In fact, we're seeing the collapse of the anti-al-Qaeda sanctions regime with Mohammed Islambuli, a high-level member in the Khorasan group in Syria, being delisted by the United Nations just 2 days ago. Our own actions have an impact and prevent us from countering some of these negative developments. Let's not lose sight of the fact that our actions are communicative acts. When you look at our policies in Syria, which the Oversight Committee obviously also is concerned about, one thing that's come up within the past few weeks after Russia started bombing is complaints from officials about how Russia was bombing US-backed rebels. There's an amazing article by Ken Delaney in the Associated Press, published on October 10th, where he talks about how US officials said that our rebels were gaining ground prior to the Russian bombing. When he names where those rebels were gaining ground, in Idlib, in Hama, it's obvious that the people at the forefront were Jaish al-Fatah, the coalition that's associated with al-Qaeda. Like, I wish this were conspiracy theory. I wish this were hyperbole. But US officials are talking about the fact that our rebels are helping al-Qaeda make advances on the ground. This is of grave concern because it is ultimately a communicative act. Our actions are communicative acts. And if we take actions that are contrary to our values and arguably contrary to US law, that can stop us from preventing this tremendous shift where al-Qaeda is now operating much more openly. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Fernandez, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Lynch, other members, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. The ISIS appeal is truly revolutionary. This is a complete package which includes a strong ideological component deeply rooted in a specific Salafi jihadist reading of the period of formative Islam, a political project of building the caliphate state, which is seen as a going concern, and a 21st century appeal to substantive and consequential participation aimed at youth searching for purpose and identity in a seemingly aimless, empty, and hedonistic world. Social media itself is not the heart of the issue. Social media is the accelerant. It's the thing that turbocharges a poisonous and powerful message. This appeal that ISIS has come closer than that of many other Islamist terrorist groups in mainstreaming its discussion, mainstreaming its worldview, and has, as other witnesses have said, ignited a terrorist media arms race with other groups seeking to match what the Islamic State is doing. The propaganda of ISIS is connected to the reality on the ground. The carnage in Syria and the victories in Iraq are eventually what led to the declaration of the caliphate, and we saw online support spike through the roof in the aftermath of these events. What are some of the practical steps that can be taken? Number one, we need to realize that military victory is the best way to weaken ISIS propaganda appeal. There's a connection between the real world and the propaganda. The propaganda gets weakened when the reality on the ground changes. Number two, as has been said here, there needs to be much better policing of social media. Not all social media companies are the same. Facebook has made real progress, but YouTube, Twitter, and others lag behind. It is overdue for Congress and for others to have a serious exchange of views, a serious conversation with social media companies on the terrorist presence on the internet and how these companies violate terms of services, let alone the question of legality. Better policing of the internet will decrease the numbers of ISIS propagandists and help those who are fighting it be increased. There is value in making it inconvenient for them. Number two, people are radicalized in clusters as part of a personal relationship, either directly or in person online. We know that recent converts, 40% of ISIS, people want to join ISIS have been recent converts in the United States, and second-generation immigrants are particularly at risk. We need to an international civil society by both consistent funding and training with these lost and questing souls. Enlist people who have a talent for engagement. Third, Syria is important. ISIS seeks to present Syria as a mobilizing factor to mobilize people, to radicalize them, to get them to do something. They present a false image of the reality in Syria, and there is power in helping the Syrian people, victims of ISIS, survivors of ISIS violence, being able to communicate the reality on the ground that is often not known by a teenager in Mississippi or in California. Finally, the last point I would mention is the issue of volume. Volume has value. We all know in our personal lives how you may see a obscure idea or strange idea be amplified by social media because a lot of people are pushing it. It is incredible to me that to this day, the United States, friendly countries in the West and in the Middle East are outnumbered by the Islamic State. And you need volume to make the message more powerful. You need a network to fight a network. There have been some small steps taken by the State Department, by friendly governments to begin to do this, but we need to do a lot more. You need to encourage people and inspire them like ISIS does to do propaganda, or you need to rent them. But you need to find a way to form loose, open-source communities of interest or swarms that can swarm back and push back against the ISIS message. It's not an impossible thing to do. It can be done. We just need to have a little more will and a little more support in doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ambassador Wallace, you talked about how you can be in a queue if you report some of the social media companies. But I noticed there was that incident, it was probably a month and a half ago, where you had an individual, deranged individual, film him killing a newspaper reporter online, and he was posting that on social media. And that got taken down very quickly, and rightfully so. So they definitely have the capacity to do it. So what is keeping them from acting with that same swiftness when you're talking about terrorism?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's obviously the question of the moment, in my opinion, regarding many of the social media companies, particularly Twitter. There's this notion, and perhaps it's hubris, that we have a right to social media in the Constitution, that we have a right to tweet in the Constitution. Last time I checked my Constitution, there's no reference to Twitter. It's a reference to free speech. And for history, throughout our history, we have thoughtfully debated the appropriate limitations on what's legitimate speech and what is not legitimate speech. And I hope by this hearing and by my colleagues that we have that debate on the nature of some of these communications. Twitter does not effectively take down accounts quickly enough or search them out quickly enough when it does so in a variety of other areas, whether it was stalking of women or other abuse, like the example that you referenced, child pornography and the like. That's the first problem. They don't effectively take it down when it's up. Even when we report it, it's not taken down quickly. And the second problem, if I may, is they come back. Congressman Lynch referred to the game of whack-a-mole. I used that in a previous testimony. I agree that whack-a-mole is an apt analogy, except for one point. When you bop one in whack-a-mole, it comes back with fewer followers. But look at this example. You have a jihadi tweeting that he is having his 100th account suspended with similar names. That's unacceptable. We have to have a debate. We have to have a discussion at this committee about how if Twitter and the likes of Twitter don't find ways of solving this problem themselves, we need to find a way to help them solve that problem.
There's this hashtag CEP, digital disruption. Can you explain what that means and talk about the work you're doing to combat radicalization propaganda?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As my colleague, Ambassador Fernandez said, we took it upon ourselves to create a hashtag to try to report accounts and digitally disrupt, if you will, the misuse of online accounts. So we've created a team of young people, many of whom are behind me today, and in our offices in New York and Washington, where we try to report and take down as many accounts as we can, effectively engaging in the game of whack-a-mole. And by creating a dynamic online constituency, we call on those that support our effort to also report accounts. But we need a partner. We need a partner in the likes of Twitter that will respond quickly to our work and hopefully the work of others. I think Alberto mentioned that we need to have 1,000, I mean, you didn't use these words, but 1,000 flowers blossom. We should do it in private. The government should do it in public. If we all report these accounts and create a network to take it down, we can be effective. CEP hashtag digital disruption is our bit in that effort.
Mr. Purdy, you mentioned radicalization by people like Anwar al-Awlaki. What tools are used to radicalize individuals that I think that are the most concerning?
I think the tools that we constantly see people using on social media are videos and also referring individuals to books and other individuals who can help in that radicalization process. You know, 14 years ago when that kid from California was going down that pathway of radicalization, he had to go and sit with somebody out there in California, not in a mosque, but after a mosque. Today, these individuals, anybody with a phone can now go online, and they're directed to particular sites where they can watch videos. They can actually be tweeting with somebody that's in Syria today who's sending them back pictures and look at what we are doing today. And especially for young people who ISIS is targeting, and they are targeting young individuals. If we look at the people, the individuals who have been locked up the last year, you know, the individuals are clearly, there are certain themes. They're all very young. They're disenfranchised in one way or another. Last night, I just happened to, in speaking to a group, I had a girl come up and speak to me, and she said, I was a student with Zachary Chesser in Falls Church, Virginia. I went to high school with him, and these are some things that I remember about this. And this individual, kind of what changed as this young woman knew him, kind of that radicalization process. He said all of a sudden he started growing a beard. All of a sudden he started not hanging out with kids and individuals. That almost self-cloistering of this one individual. And then changing and not wanting anything to do with females or other Westerners. And we've seen that from Mohammed Siddiqui Khan in London with the July 2005 bombers that, again, self-radicalized themselves, being able to go online and go to particular sites where they can acquire this information.
Great. My time's expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank you again, members of the panel, for your wonderful testimony. The struggle in dealing with some of the platforms, whether it be Twitter or WhatsApp or Facebook, and I acknowledge that there's variable response rates from those different organizations. The problem we have is that we have to try to balance national security, and we all agree that ISIL is out there and is an immediate threat. We also have to try to balance that against the rights of free speech that people have, and that's been the struggle here. But in reality, Ambassador Wallace, your group's been out there. You're engaged in you're doing some good work, and you're reporting on some of the stuff that's over the top. Where do you draw the line? I mean, where do you, it's, Mr. Purdy, you mentioned Milestones by Qutb, which was written probably back in the 50s, or maybe even earlier. I'm not sure if I'm right on that, but it's a piece of literature that has led to the radicalization of some groups, but people might argue that has value elsewhere in Islam. Where do you draw the line where some postings are a threat and need to be taken down, and what are the things that we are seeing now an easy call, or do we get into this debate? Some of these people are clearly, they're putting videos on there of executions, things like that, which is an easy call, I would imagine. What are the, how does your organization do some of its greatest work in terms of forcing, these platforms to take down some of this stuff?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, I think that the analysis and this debate that you just framed very eloquently is a debate that we've had in other contexts before. We have, at times in our history, weighed free speech versus a challenge that we think is against the law or a challenge to our society. And there are a whole realm of areas of speech that we've said is wrong, and we've prohibited it. I think the mere fact that we're having this discussion is advancing the ball. I would just hope that we could invigorate an even bigger discussion about that debate, because whatever comes of it will be better than we have now, in my opinion. But look, I think that the analysis for us is relatively simple. If I were to send a hunting knife to ISIS, I think all of you would say, Wallace, you're providing material support to ISIS because that hunting knife could be used for dastardly things. And a hunting knife is pretty benign. So ultimately, it's really a material support analysis. And we feel that if an online propagandist is recruiting, I think material support is seeking financial support, material support, is calling to act on behalf of a terrorist group, that's material support. I think the propaganda sometimes can be a closer call, but I think we should have the debate. I personally believe if you are a Twitter person and putting out boatloads of propaganda on behalf of the specially designated national ISIS, I think that should be prohibited speech. and I think we should have the debate on that. So I think the analysis is already found in our law. It's a question of expanding upon it and ensuring that we implement that in the context of social media.
Okay, that's helpful. Anybody else want to take a crack at that? Or I have another follow-up question in terms of how we actually accomplish this. There are two models that in the testimony here this morning. One is sort of a cyber battalion where we would have a government screening process of taking these down and looking at them. The other is has also been raised by testimony this morning, which is let a thousand flowers bloom, where you have private society, individuals out there reporting, so that we use that force multiplier, if you will, of just people online. If you see something, report it, and then have others take action on that. Is there a preference or a way? I realize the scope of this is pretty large, but is there a preferred approach as to having government do it versus calling on individual citizens to be more vigilant? Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, Doctor?
Sir, I think you can do both, and I think that it's best if you have both functioning at once. I think the main thing I'd argue for both government and also civil society activists is that when you look at what ISIS has done online, it's very innovative. And often our own efforts aren't as innovative and aren't as strategic. In terms of strategy, I highlight, and I think Ambassador Fernandez did a good job in his testimony of highlighting some areas of vulnerability for ISIS. I mean, there's a group that is so invested in its brutality, in its, what I call its winner's message in my testimony, that once chinks are put in this armor, once there are clear areas in which they're failing and not living up to this image of strength, then they actually very much are in danger of a brand reversal. I would suggest that one thing we can look to in terms of bodies of literature is literature being put out by people who do academic work on business. Like, they're very much an organization that has a certain brand, and it's a brand that's working now, but it won't always work. The second thing I'll say in terms of innovativeness, we've talked about taking down their accounts individually, and that has a disruptive effect. But ultimately, they're in an online environment. We actually have the capability to literally map every single member of a distribution network, every single account, and take them all down at once, as opposed to reporting them individually. That's thinking innovatively. Let's not take them down one at a time. Let's take them all down. And Twitter is willing to take down these accounts. They don't have a good algorithm to take them down, but accounts are violating their terms of service. And so I think that there's an area in which either from a government these networks, and you'll have a much more disruptive effect if you take down the whole network as opposed to one node at a time.
Great, thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many people today, both liberal and conservative, say that the original decision to go into Iraq in 2002 was the biggest foreign policy mistake in the history of this country. William Buckley, for instance, said similar words to that shortly before he passed away. George Will wrote a column saying that the neoconservatives who were the strongest advocates of our war were really the very misnamed people. He said actually they were the most radical people in this city. And the more we read about this, the worse it seems to get. Just yesterday, for instance, I read that the New York Times had written that most of the leadership of most of its soldiers were former members of the Iraqi army, and that we made a mistake when we filed a policy of de-Baathification and disbanding the Iraqi army shortly after we started that second war in Iraq. Is that, do you gentlemen think the New York Times was correct? Are most of the leadership of ISIS former Iraqi military people? Anybody? Yes, sir. Ambassador.
on. Yes, sir. It seems like the majority of the leadership are, if you talk about sheer numbers, have a connection with the Iraqi army at some point. You know, there was an Islamization process that occurred in the last years of Saddam Hussein where the Ba'athist ideology of the government was, you know, they allowed Islamists to flourish. But what causes ISIS to succeed, I contend, are three elements. One is the one you mentioned, absolutely, Iraq. Two, Syria. And three, the rise of social media. When ISIS does its propaganda in 2013, 2014, it's not telling people to go fight in Iraq. It's telling people to go fight in Syria because the Muslims are being killed in Syria. So yes, the leadership of ISIS is overwhelmingly Iraqi and with a strong former military component. But the message that they use first was about Syria, and after June of 2014 is about the caliphate.
Let me say this. I know some of us are wanting to, some people want us to go in a big way back into Syria, yet General Petraeus testified a couple of weeks ago at a Senate hearing that Putin's foreign reserves are less than $200 billion total. And I saw the 60 Minutes report this past Sunday night about ISIS, and it said in that report, and I have the transcript here, that we're spending $10 million a day in our bombing campaign, which has been going on for 14 months. That's $300 million a month. Apparently, over the 14 or 15 months we've been doing this, we've spent about $4.5 to $5 billion on this so far. Yet the military man said, but ISIS has been able to replace its dead with new recruits, so the estimated number of enemy figures remains unchanged, 20 to 30,000 last year, 20 to 30,000 this year. David Martin, the CBS correspondent, said, so as long as they can keep bringing fighters in there, are you just shoveling sand against the tide? And then he ended up his report saying this. He said, some 25,000 American bombs have been dropped so far, all the firepower and technology of a superpower, even supersonic stealth aircraft, directed against an enemy in pickup trucks, intent on dragging the Middle East back to the Middle Ages. And what I think at some point, since we're over $18 trillion in debt, at some point somebody's going to have to start showing some progress. As far as I'm concerned, you can do anything to ISIS, the worst punishment that you could come up with. But on the other hand, we can't just keep throwing billions and billions and billions of dollars and not showing any progress. And in fact, some people think it's helping to radicalize or even help recruit troops for ISIS. At some point, these people in the Middle East are going to have to start fighting their own wars because we can't afford to just keep pouring billions or even trillions down these Middle Eastern rat holes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Representative Duncan that we're wasting taxpayer funds by bombing in Syria. I have seen no good results from that. In fact, you're seeing more Syrians flee. And that sort of goes to my question to you, Ambassador Fernandez, which I agree with you that you say that social media is not the cause of radicalization. It is an accelerant. And really, the problem is the message. Don't you think the U.S. bombing in Syria actually gives a lot of propaganda to ISIL and ISIS?
Thank you, sir. If you look at the propaganda, actually, U.S. bombing of Syria is not a major element in ISIS propaganda. It's occasionally featured. It's not a big element in the propaganda. The number one element in the propaganda is about building this paradise on earth, building the caliphate. Come and join us. Come and emigrate. Let's build the beautiful future. You know, like communists or Nazis talk about the beautiful future that you're building. But if you look at their propaganda, they talk about America, the head of the snake. They talk about destroying America. But very few of their videos actually show U.S. bombing. That's just not there. There are a handful, but considering the thousands of videos that they produce, it's a tiny part of what they show.
So they don't talk about the U.S. attacking them?
For Salafi jihadist groups, The U.S. is the enemy. The U.S. is the new Rome. And they were saying that before we started bombing them, and if we stopped tomorrow, they would continue to say that.
All right, so their message is more about building the caliphate there.
And conquering the world, yes.
And do they say conquer the world, or they just want their ISO area?
Well, they want their ISO area, obviously, to start out with, but the new 5-dinar gold coin that ISIS issued, on the back it has a map of the world. And when the ISIS spokesman explained why the ISIS gold dinar has the map of the world, they said because that is the place that the rule of Allah has to take place. And he says, and specifically, it means 3 places: Constantinople, Istanbul of Islamic prophecy, Rome, and America. Those are the 3 ones that they talk about. Obviously, this is rhetoric, but this is what they say.
Okay, and your view is U.S. bombs in Syria isn't really affecting their propaganda?
It's not a major element of it. It's there, but it would rank really low in the top themes that they use. It's not a primary theme in their propaganda.
And does their leadership sort of get upset when their folks get killed by U.S. bombs?
They don't tend to talk about that. So actually it does, because obviously if your message is الدولة الإسلامية باقية وتتمدد, the Islamic State is here to stay and growing. And why is it growing? Because God's permission is that it is to grow. Anything that shows them as losers, anything that shows them as going backwards, is problematic with them. So when a person is killed, obviously they say this person's a martyr, but they don't usually play up that such and such a person was killed by the Americans.
Great, thank you. And then Ambassador Wallace, thank you for your public service. I think some of the statements you made I do find alarming. I do not believe the U.S. government should be prohibiting speech based on content. And if you have the government start refereeing what is propaganda or not, it becomes very problematic, because if we're going to start shutting down a Twitter account because someone says, I support ISIL, then what happens if someone says, you know, I support Assad? He's sort of a brutal dictator. Well, what if someone says, I support the Ku Klux Klan? At some point, how does the government determine what message is going to shut down and what they're not? And I'm all for what you do and what the private sector does and what nonprofits do. I just believe the government ought not to be sitting there deciding what content to shut down or not. And even if we did, I believe the U.S. Supreme Court would strike as unconstitutional. And so with that, I'll let you have a chance to answer that, and then I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Liu. First of all, I just think we would be remiss in saying that it's American bombs. The President has done a very capable job, in my opinion, of establishing an Arab coalition that is bombing ISIS. And some of the horrible deaths that we've seen of soldiers in theater have been non-Americans, such as the Jordanian pilot that was shot down and killed. So let's be clear, there are Arab bombs that are going in there as well as American bombs. Look, on your point, I think there are a lot of lawyers in the room. I suffer that affliction as well. I don't think it's as controversial as you think. We're having a thoughtful discussion about it. We've had this thoughtful debate for years about all sorts of speech, and we've concluded some speech is not acceptable. For example, the Ku Klux Klan, I don't mean to pick on any particular horribly obnoxious group that is entitled to speak freely in the United States, but they get to say, I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan if they want to. That's not what we're talking about here. We have litigated and have an entire body of law that says some speech is legitimate, some is not. And I've offered a framework under the material support area of what speech should not be legitimate and should be prohibited in the context of terrorism. And I think that, for example, just saying, look, ISIS, maybe they stand for some good things, I think that that's a much closer call than saying, please go out and kill for ISIS, please go out and give money to ISIS, please go out and give your life to ISIS. That should be prohibited speech. That's what's dominating the internet. That's where there are tens of thousands of accounts. And I think we can thoughtfully have this debate on Capitol Hill, and I would, in your opinion, is absolutely, even though I disagree with it, a legitimate opinion, and let's have that debate, and let's figure out where we draw the line. We've done it many times in the course of our law, from stalking women to abuse to screaming fire in a crowded theater to child pornography. Let's have it in the context of terrorism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel for being here today. Very interesting and informative, and I appreciate the expertise that you bring to the table. Mr. Purdy, let me begin with you. Can you describe for me a little bit about the program, the Mirror Image? I understand that it's something that allows law enforcement to walk in the shoes of terrorists or something to that effect. Could you describe that a little further, please?
Yes, the Mirror Image Training to Combat Terrorism is a program that we designed to allow law enforcement, military, and intelligence to step into the shoes of a terrorist cell or a network. And the idea behind that was what Sun Tzu said. You know, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you're going to be able to defeat them. And so what we came up with after a series of interviews with some individuals, we thought that would be a good training format to get people to understand, first and foremost, what is it that these terrorists are trying to do. One of the things I think we have to do a better job is getting people to understand what terrorist organizations are trying to do when they put a communication online. So through Mirror Image, we would take a group of usually 40, 50 people, and for a week to 2 weeks, we would show them by having them become the terrorist. So FBI, law enforcement, military intelligence, intelligence folks, so that they could then actually have done this. Usually they're working against these individuals, but it's been quite eye-opening for these individuals to see it from the other side. There's a lot of great lessons that can be learned by reading what they're putting out, by doing the types of things that they do to understand that mentality. So as they combat these individuals, they'll have a greater understanding and hopefully be able to deal with this situation.
So I take it then from your answer that you believe this has been quite beneficial.
I have had military individuals tell me that when they went to Iraq, that training saved lives. I've had law enforcement individuals said, what we learned in your program enabled us to not only understand the terrorists, but to be somewhat predictive in what a terrorist was attempting to do. So yes, sir.
Very good. Let me transition over to you, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross. What do you think, at the end of the day, is actually attracting people to ISIS caliphate?
I think there's multiple things attracting people to the ISIS caliphate, and I think it's somewhat different based upon personality and region. You know, ISIS actually has on some of their web pages a different interface that you receive depending upon where you're from. So if you're looking at them and you're a Westerner, for some of their pages, you'll get a different page than if you're visiting from the Middle East. There's two major themes in their propaganda, though, that I would point to, even though there are many things that draw people to them. One theme is their strength. And as I said, they're extraordinarily brutal, but they're okay with that because their brutality, beheading people, burning people alive, this is a sign that they're winning. This is a sign of how strong they are. That's one element that's very strong in their propaganda. A second element, and Charlie Winter writes about this for the Quilliam Foundation quite well, a British-based think tank, is that they're building a state. Ambassador Fernandez referred to that. That's the second aspect of their propaganda, both destruction and also creation. I think both of those are vulnerable to disruption. On the one hand, we were talking a bit about whether the bombing campaign has accomplished anything or not. Right now, ISIS is fighting a 10-front war. And if you look at the past couple of months, they've experienced one loss after another. One of their biggest gains this year, Ramadi, is under a lot of pressure, and the odds are that they will lose it within the next, say, 8 to 10 months.
If you don't mind, let me interrupt. I've only got about a minute left,
Sure.
and just open up a question to each of you. Do any of you know what the objectives are of our current administration in terms of their national strategy for countering violent extremism? So I take it from that no one knows what our strategy is.
The President, in his global summit, did identify 2 areas he was focusing on. We might disagree with the parameters of that, but he focused on training youth around the world to promote tolerance and counter extremist ideologies at a young person's level, generation.
Promote tolerance to extremism?
You asked a question about what they're doing. I'm not taking sides here, sir. I'm giving you.
No, I'm just, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that's what I understand that the President's agenda is. But I'm giving you an answer to your question. I'm not in the administration, sir. I'm retired.
All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I see my time. We have no understanding of our own administration's strategy to deal with this, and what we do here of what we believe it is quite alarming. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
This is a gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Ambassador Wallace, good to see you again. It's been a while in New York City. One of my first questions to you, sir, you mentioned the individual that had opened and closed 100 accounts on Twitter by a different name. What are you proposing that Twitter do about it?
Good to see you, Congressman, and thank you for allowing me to appear before you as well. Look, there was a classic example. I'm sure some of my colleagues remember Mujahideen Miski, who was one of the most influential and prolific online jihadis. He was a Somali American, ostensibly tweeting from Somalia, we believe Iraq, ostensibly killed in a drone strike a couple months ago, I think, guys. He was incredibly prolific and kept coming back, and he would, I don't remember his handle, but it was Mujahideen Miski 1, take him down. Mujahideen Miski 2, take him down. And it would rely on people reporting his reappearance on Twitter. I think that
But them taking it down, isn't that a success?
Well, only after reporting. I think where Twitter was failing to act is that if he was coming back with a similar handle, it shouldn't have had to go through the fairly elaborate, time-consuming reporting process. Twitter should have said, Miski 2 is up, let's make sure he goes down. Miski 3 is up, and take him down. And I think that's one of the issues with Twitter, that they are not actively policing in an appropriate manner terrorist content on their site.
So when your organization gets this kind of information, do you share it directly with Twitter? Do you share it with Department of Homeland Security? Do you share it with the FBI? Who do you share it with?
We certainly share it with Twitter, and we go through a reporting process with Twitter that is somewhat cumbersome. One of the things I've called for in this testimony and in previous testimony, is that trusted reporting status, which would be an accelerated reporting status, be granted to organizations like ours, the State Department, some of my colleagues on this panel, so that it doesn't fall into the really lengthy queue, if you will, of reporting on Twitter. Twitter has not yet taken that action. We think that's a problem.
And earlier, I just want to make sure I'm clear. Were you intimating that social media companies are providing material support to terrorists?
I'm intimating that we should have that debate, and I'm glad that you asked the question, and I'm glad that I'm getting honored to provide the answer.
So when I was chasing al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the back alleys, they would do things called night letters. They would write a letter, leave it on a doorstep. Were we intimating that the companies that produce pens and pencils and paper are providing material support to terrorists?
I've learned over the years never to throw back a question to a congressman asking you a question, but I'm really tempted to do it here. What about a Kalashnikov? What about a hunting knife? I think that our debate has to say, we've debated in other contexts, maybe a pencil isn't material support, but is a hunting knife, is an AK, is an RPG?
I would say that providing an account on a social media site is not material support. I don't think that's anywhere close to material support. And if these organizations are not taking these things down, they're working closely with Department of Homeland Security. So, I have to echo the concerns of the gentleman from California about talking about, yes, it's good to have a conversation about legitimate speech, but I think we also need to be careful. You're not a law enforcement organization. You're not an intelligence organization. The information that you're getting is valuable and should be shared. But saying that that's the only game in town is a little scary. Changing gears. There's a professor visiting from Spain at GW, Dr. Javier Lasaca, who's done some very interesting work on analyzing the social media campaigns of ISIS. They do 4 campaigns a day. They are, promoting it in about 49 different languages. My question is, who's out there that's countering this ideology? And Ambassador, I think it was you, actually, it was Mr. Gartenstein-Ross. You mentioned about some of these failures of ISIS. They talk about, we have this great functioning land. Well, it's not really that much. You know, they encourage young men to come to ISIS to fight the infidel, but you're more likely to get a bomb dropped on your head or a bullet in your chest than you are to find excitement in Syria. And there's not, you know, this is not just for the federal government to get that message out. It's going to be organizations, it's going to be our Sunni Arab partners in the region. Who's out there actually countering that narrative and getting that message out?
Well, first of all, let me say, sir, that I agree with that entirely, that it's not just a job for the federal government. You have a variety of centers which are out there. A new one just opened up in the United Arab Emirates in Doha, which is a joint project of the United States and the Emirates. There's also a communication center which has opened in Nigeria. So I think that there's some interesting innovations that are occurring to try to get the U.S. to work with local partners. Secondly, there's civil society organizations, such as the one that I mentioned before, the Quilliam Foundation, which really makes an effort to try to push out messages that are counter to extremism. I think some of the more effective ones highlight the bad experiences of defectors, people who had gone over to fight with the Islamic State and found that life was not all they thought it was cracked up to be. I think that those are both important. The third thing I would mention is that tech companies, in fact, are starting to get interested in this problem set. If you look at and this has been reported, content providers, including in the United States, people from the American Muslim community who have messages that are quite contrary to ISIS's message. I'll highlight one final thing, which is one problem I've noted in the past is that ISIS is very good at creating facts, fabricating facts. It makes itself look stronger than it actually is. One area where I think the U.S. government can play a very good role is contacting media companies with fact sheets in order to counteract ISIS's exaggerations. Things like when they convinced CNN, BBC, and others that they controlled the city of Derna in Libya, which they never did. Being able to quickly reach out to media contacts and say, you've reported this, ISIS has fabricated this fact, it's untrue, would be helpful in just making sure that the mainstream media doesn't end up echoing ISIS's propaganda.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Apologize for going over time, Chairman. I yield back.
Well, we just have so many people in the queue, you know, so I appreciate it. I know Steve and I are going to ask some more questions, so we will go another round if the other members are inclined. You know, we've been talking about, and rightfully so, the propaganda about this global caliphate, and it's a Sunni caliphate. But, you know, I've noted that Ayatollah Khamenei will tweet different things. And so, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, what is the use of social media from the Shiite extremist side? I mean, you know, Iran is establishing a de facto Shiite caliphate from Afghanistan border to the Mediterranean Sea. Are we seeing the same type of techniques being used with groups like Hezbollah and other Shiite-type militias in maybe Yemen or these places?
Yes, we're seeing similar efforts on the Shia side. Most of the U.S.'s focus is on Sunni extremist groups. An analyst who I think has done the best work on this is Philip Smythe, S-M-Y-T-H, who wrote a monograph earlier this year published by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And he's looked extensively at the Shia side. They also do mobilize people through social media. They also have Shia foreign fighters who have gone to Syria, and it presents a similar set of concerns. And the final thing I'll mention there is, similar to ISIS, they also are committing grave atrocities in the theater. While they have different goals than ISIS, it also is something that is running counter to U.S. strategic interests and is causing a major...
How has the social media affected terrorism by Palestinians against Israelis? Because I mean, you look at the Intifada at the beginning of the last decade. Yeah, we had the internet and stuff, but you didn't have Twitter, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have a lot of this stuff. Now I know that there's you know, some significant problems that are going on. Are we seeing evidence that you know, some of the Palestinian terrorists are using social media?
Definitely. I mean, look, there's a few ways in which social media has a direct impact on the current, you know, nascent intifada that's occurring. One is it's a remarkable mobilizing tool, a tool that can get people out, and you can have a campaign that's organized via social media. People can organize much more quickly than they could previously. The second thing, one thing that is occurring in this conflict is people will be out there, for example, throwing rocks with a cell phone. And they'll be taking photos of what's happening to them in order to try to make sure that they capture the moment and it gets disseminated right away via social media. So it's fundamentally at the center. It is a tool that is at the center of how people are tactically thinking about this current conflict.
Yeah, great. And then when someone gets killed, I know some of the headlines, New York Times will say that somebody was killed by a rock. They won't say how or what, but anyways, it's not a discussion for today. I'm going to yield to Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move out a little bit from the tactical discussion we've been having about social media and really look at this from a long-term strategy perspective, if we could, for a minute. I spent a lot of time on this issue. I'm one of the few that have actually gone in and talked to Assad. It was a few years ago. The paradox here, and I've also met with all the major rebel groups, and I just have to say that this idea, this fiction of a moderate Syrian rebel group, I just don't see it. Not in the terms of moderate in which we in this country regard it. The rebel groups are all Islamic. Oddly enough, Assad, and he needs to go, no question about it. There's a consensus around that, except for Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. Ironically, he provides protection to religious minorities, and the people that we're trying to help and I've met with them in refugee camps and Gaziantep and Istanbul, and they're Islamists, and they want to create an Islamic republic, and to various degrees they want to push an Islamic model on the population there. So it provides a real dilemma for us. I heard some testimony yesterday from Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and also our new head of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, they were talking about Sergeant Wheeler, who had been killed recently. God bless him and his family. They were talking about the possibility of putting boots on the ground to some extent for various purposes. And if you go back to what Petraeus talked about in Iraq in terms of the surge and giving the Iraqis an opportunity there, his counterinsurgency program, which was very successful until we handed off our responsibility. That was the weak link in his program, in the program. I see it as the weak link in any program that we have with Syria. When you look at Syria, let's just say that Assad goes, either by negotiation or by force. Who do we hand off to? And I'm not saying that rhetorically. I'm asking you, who do we hand off to? Because I've met with all the players there. And, I don't think anyone is there of any significant strength that we could say, okay, we've killed the bad guys, if that's what we say, or we've taken out Assad. Here you go. I don't see anybody in the region now who could actually step in and do that job. So if you're going to envision using boots on the ground, you ought to have an exit strategy going in. And I just don't see anybody we can hand off to, and I think we would be sucked in to a program where we would have to try to create, this is Iraq 2.0, we would have to create the institutions to guide that country for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I know you weren't hired to do this job, but I'd love to get you all spend time on this. If you could just share your thoughts on that whole question with me, that'd be great. Mr. Wallace, Ambassador.
Thank you for your thoughts. I would say that Assad isn't doing the job. That's one thing that we do have to remember. I mean, obviously, Syria is an area of incredible turmoil and otherwise. And on top of him not doing the job because of the incredible migration problems, the human suffering, the toll that's taken there, he is the proxy of Iran. And I think we've somewhat overlooked it, not through any intention. I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but the State Department, and I think all of us still view Iran as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And I think that the growth of Iranian hegemony in the region has stoked the sectarian flames. So I think we have a double problem, if you will. Assad isn't the solution. Whether or not he was before, it's beyond, we don't get a do-over, it's whatever it is now. And I think we can do much better in finding a better solution than Assad and the human suffering that's taking there, and hopefully not continue to empower the Iranian regime, which I think has been regrettably on the march since the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and its proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen. So I think that the concern is Iran and the number of Shia and the destabilizing influence of Iran throughout the region that is stoking sectarian conflict and radicalizing a lot of the Sunnis. Let's remember that the initial rebellion against Assad was actually pretty secular. It was a secular movement against Assad, but that was a missed opportunity.
Doctor, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, definitely. I think your question is a very important one, and that's why I mentioned this issue of Syria in my testimony. I think that fundamentally, what we're doing in Syria and what we do in Syria is linked to our ability to communicate effectively on these issues related to extremism. I agree with the way that you framed it very strongly. And I think that in addition to the fact that these groups are not what we would regard as moderates, we should also note the degree to which al-Qaeda is strong enough on the ground to really dominate Syrian factions whom we'd otherwise consider to be acceptable. So in the LA Times on October the 12th, you have an individual, Major Fares Bayoush, who's the commander of Firsan al-Haq, which is a group we regard as moderate, who said that some level of coordination with al-Qaeda-style groups was unavoidable. The quote in the LA Times is, "There is something misunderstood by world powers. We have to work with Nusra Front and other groups to fight the regime in Taish." And this is someone who we're supporting. That reinforces your point about the rebels, and we have to fundamentally understand that. TOW missiles have been used, American-provided TOW missiles have used to help these groups advance. Now, let me be clear. It's not because the United States is trying to help bad people. I think that the U.S. tends to be on the side of the angels, but we're very blunderingly on the side of the angels. And I think that we wanted to back this uprising against Assad, given that he is an awful dictator. But then when the facts on the ground revealed just how much extremist factions were dominating the battle space, we didn't adapt. Our adaptation was to go ahead and help those extremist factions to gain ground. In addition to the idea of boots on the ground being problematic for the reasons that you articulated, I think it is important to look into our current policies. As I said, following the Russian bombing, U.S. officials were talking about how they considered our program of supporting rebels through the CIA to be successful. And when they looked at rebel successes, they were pointing to areas where the Nusra Front gained ground. If we are backing rebels who are helping al-Qaeda to make advances, we can't very credibly say to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to Turkey, now you guys can't support them, because we are indirectly, not directly, but we're doing the same thing. And I think that's something which is very much worth looking into, including the question of whether these programs violate U.S. law and the question of whether Congress has been given accurate information on what the rebel groups that we're supporting are doing.
Great. I'm not sure. Ambassador, would you mind if? Yeah, Ambassador Fernandez, and then.
Yes, sir. I would just make 2 points. I think your concerns are well stated. There's a shocking reality, and that is that for millions of Sunni Arab Muslims in that area of Syria and Iraq, ISIS and ISIS rule seems as the least bad option, considering the alternatives. That's a huge problem for U.S. foreign policy. And on the rebels, on the moderate rebels, you're right. There was a golden opportunity earlier this year when Jaish al-Fatah, The conquest army, supported by the Qataris and the Saudis, took over most of the province of Idlib. This is a province that had a Christian minority and a Druze minority. And so it was a golden opportunity for them to prove their tolerance. The Christian minority has ceased to exist, they're gone, and the Druze minority was forced to convert to Islam. The rhetoric was a little less nasty, a little less hard-edged than ISIS, but the reality was not much different.
All right. Mr. Purdy?
I think one of the problems we have is when the United States removes leaders, and there's kind of a historical list in this region from Egypt, kind of Mubarak, Yemen, Saleh, Libya, Gaddafi, and now we're talking about removing or trying to push out the president of Syria. None of these individuals are angels, and none of these individuals are people that our government would want to truly be partnered with because of human rights and all kinds of other things that these individuals have done. But when we push one of these leaders out, there always seems to be a void that's created. And what we constantly see is, whether it's AQAP or Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they step right into that void that we have had a hand in kind of creating. And it causes us long-term problems. Because now, as we try to look and gain coalition partners and other people, there are other geopolitical reasons maybe why somebody might want to go in and do something or hold back, because we've created a mess.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I went way over time. Thank you.
No problem. I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.